In 1847, a single commodity moved across the steppes of Central Asia with more protection than gold. Caravans stretched for miles. Armed guards rode day and night. Entire cities rose and fell based on its flow. That commodity was not silk. It was not spices. It was salt. But the maps that show where it came from have mostly disappeared. The records that explain how it moved in such quantities rarely mention the infrastructure that made it possible. And the geological surveys conducted in the decades that followed found something unexpected. The sources they described should not have been able to produce what the trade routes demanded. Yet the trade existed. The cities existed. The wealth was real. For centuries, historians have explained the salt roads of Eurasia as extensions of older trade networks. Salt was mined in a few known locations. It was carried by camel and horse. It was traded in markets from the Caspian to the Darim Basin. The explanation is simple. The geology supports it. The written records confirm it. But this explanation leaves something out. It does not account for the volume. Between 1820 and 1850, European surveyors traveling through regions once labeled as Tartary began filing reports about ruins they could not explain. Massive stone structures stood in areas with no current population. In several cases, these structures were located near dry lake beds that showed evidence of salt deposits. The deposits were not small. They were industrial in scale, and yet no modern operation had ever worked them. The surveyors noted this in their logs. They did not have an explanation. The reports were archived. Most were never published. Look closely at the trade data from this period. In 1842, a British officer stationed near the Aral Sea recorded the movement of a caravan carrying salt. He estimated its weight at over 400 tons. The caravan had originated somewhere to the east. It was heading toward Persia. He asked the caravan leader where the salt had been mined. The answer he received was vague. The leader pointed in a direction and used a name that did not appear on any map the officer carried. The officer wrote this down. He noted that the salt itself was unusually pure, purer than what was typically found in surface mines. He suspected it had been extracted using a method he was unfamiliar with. He did not investigate further. His mission was not geological, but the note remained in the record. This was not an isolated case. In 1835, a Russian explorer named Grigory Karelin traveled along the northeastern shore of the Caspian. He documented several abandoned sites. At one location, he found the remnants of what he described as a processing facility. Stone channels ran in parallel lines. They were carved with precision. The channels led to large rectangular depressions in the ground. Karelin believed they had been used for evaporation. But the scale puzzled him. The depressions were far larger than anything he had seen in active salt works elsewhere. He estimated that the site, if operational, could have produced thousands of tons per season. Yet there was no local population, no nearby settlement, no infrastructure to support workers. He wrote that the site appeared to have been abandoned suddenly. He found tools still lying in place. He found no evidence of conflict. He found no graves. The maps from this era are inconsistent. Some show cities in locations where no cities currently exist. Others show rivers that have since dried up or changed course. In the region once broadly referred to as Tartary, cartographers working for European powers often copied earlier maps without verification. This created a problem. The maps showed networks, roads, trade hubs, but when surveyors arrived, they found ruins instead of cities. They found dry channels instead of rivers. They found silence instead of trade. The assumption was that the earlier maps were simply wrong. But the ruins were real. The channels were real. Something had existed. Something had moved through these places. and that something left traces. Salt was currency in the pre-modern world. Preserved food. It was used in religious rituals. It was required for livestock. Entire economies depended on it. But the economics of salt are delicate. It is heavy. It is difficult to transport over long distances. Profit margins are thin unless the source is close to the market or unless the operation is large enough to absorb costs. The salt roads of Central Asia covered thousands of miles. The terrain was harsh. Water was scarce. Banditry was common. For the trade to have been profitable at the scale described in surviving records, the sources would have needed to be extraordinarily rich. They would have needed to be accessible. And they would have needed infrastructure that required planning, engineering, maintenance. This level of organization does not appear in the historical narrative we are given. Consider the city of Khiva. In the early 19th century, it was a major hub for salt trade. Caravans arrived from the east and the north. The salt was stored in warehouses. It was taxed. It was redistributed. The records from Khiva show that the salt arriving from the north was considered the highest quality. Commanded premium prices. The records also show that the origin of this salt was listed simply as the northern fields. No further detail. No specific location. When Russian forces occupied the region in the 1860s and began surveying the territory, they searched for these northern fields. They found salt deposits, but none matched the volume or purity described in the Khiva records. The deposits they found were adequate for local use. They were not adequate for the trade network Khiva had sustained for generations. The surveyors noted this discrepancy. They did not resolve it. In 1844, a German geologist named Heinrich von Helmersen published a survey of the mineral resources of the Russian Empire. His work covered regions from the Urals to the edges of Siberia. In a section on salt, he described several large deposits near Lake Baskinchak and Lake Elton. These were known sources. They were actively mined. But von Helmersen also referenced older reports. Reports that mentioned salt lakes further east. Lakes that no longer appeared on maps. He wrote that these lakes had once supplied trade routes but were now either depleted or inaccessible. He suggested that geological changes, possibly related to seismic activity, might have caused them to dry up. He offered no proof. He moved on to other topics. The references were brief, but they were there. What geological changes could erase lakes large enough to supply an international trade network? Earthquakes can divert rivers. Volcanic activity can alter terrain. Climate shifts can reduce rainfall. But for a lake to disappear entirely, the change would need to be catastrophic. It would need to happen quickly, and it would leave evidence. Dry lake beds, salt flats, cracked earth. These features do exist in Central Asia, but they are often attributed to gradual desertification. Slow processes spread over centuries. The problem is that the trade records do not suggest gradual decline. They suggest sudden absence. Caravans that had followed certain routes for generations stopped following them. Markets that had relied on certain sources began sourcing from elsewhere. This shift happened within a single generation. In some cases, within a single decade. The architecture found in the ruins raises further questions. Stone structures in the middle of desert regions require resources, quarries, transport, skilled labor, water for construction, food for workers. These resources imply settlement. Settlement implies agriculture or trade. Agriculture requires water. Trade requires connectivity. But many of these ruins are found in locations that are now isolated. No roads lead to them. No rivers run near them. The stone used in their construction is not local. It was brought from somewhere else. Why would anyone invest that effort in a location that offers no obvious advantage? Unless the location was not isolated when the structures were built. Unless the environment was different. Unless something changed. In 1851, a British intelligence officer named Arthur Connolly, who had traveled extensively through Central Asia before his execution in Bokhara, left behind journals. His journals were edited and published posthumously. In one entry, he described a meeting with an elderly trader in the city of Merv. The trader spoke about a time when the deserts were smaller, when there were more oases, more stopping points along the caravan routes. Connolly dismissed this as exaggeration. Old men romanticized the past, but he wrote it down. He noted that similar stories were common among traders. Stories about wells that had dried up, springs that had stopped flowing, routes that had become impassable not because of war or bandits, but because the water was gone. Connolly did not investigate further. He was focused on political matters, but the pattern was there. Water defines everything in a desert economy. Without it, there is no agriculture, no settlement, no trade. The salt roads depended on a network of water sources, wells, springs, rivers, lakes. If that network collapsed, the roads would collapse with it. But how does an entire network collapse? Rivers do not simply vanish. Springs do not all dry up at once. Unless there is a deeper cause, unless something underground shifted, aquifers can be depleted. Geological faults can redirect groundwater. Tectonic activity can seal off subterranean channels. These processes are invisible. They leave no monuments, but they change everything above ground. And if such a change occurred across a wide region within a short time frame, it would look exactly like what the records describe. A sudden absence, a trade network that stops, cities that empty, roads that are abandoned. The term Tartaria itself is problematic. It was used by European cartographers to describe a vast and poorly understood region. It was not a single empire. It was not a unified culture. It was a label applied to areas that were difficult to access and difficult to govern. Over time, as European powers expanded into Central Asia, the term fell out of use. The regions were divided. New names were applied. New borders were drawn. The maps were updated. And in that process, older maps were discarded. Older records were filed away. The knowledge they contained was not lost, but it became harder to access, harder to cross-reference, harder to verify. By the 1870s, the salt trade had shifted. Russia controlled much of Central Asia. The old caravan routes were replaced by rail lines. Steam-powered transport made distance less of a barrier. The economics of salt changed. It became cheaper to produce it industrially near population centers than to haul it across deserts. The remote sources were abandoned. The infrastructure fell into disrepair. The cities that had thrived on the trade shrank or disappeared. Within 2 generations, the memory of how the old network had functioned was fading. The people who had maintained it were gone. The maps that had guided it were outdated. And the sources themselves, wherever they had been, were no longer needed. But the ruins remain. The channels remain. The dry lakes remain. And they do not fit the narrative of gradual decline. They fit the narrative of sudden interruption. Something stopped. Something broke. And the records that might explain what happened are either incomplete or were never made public. The geological surveys from the mid-19th century are difficult to locate. Many were filed in archives that are not digitized. Some were never translated. Others were classified for reasons that are no longer clear. Accessing them requires permission, requires time, requires language skills. And even when they are accessed, they raise more questions than they answer. In 1859, A surveyor named Nikolai Severtsov explored the region east of the Aral Sea. He was primarily interested in wildlife, but his reports include descriptions of terrain. He wrote about ancient riverbeds, about lake basins that showed signs of having once held water. He measured salt concentrations in the soil. He found them to be consistent with evaporated seawater or mineral-rich lake water. He noted that the concentrations were highest in areas where no current water source existed. He speculated that the region had experienced significant environmental change within the recent past. He did not define what he meant by recent. He did not suggest a cause. He moved on. The logistics of moving 400 tons of salt by caravan are staggering. Camels can carry roughly 200 kilograms each. That means 2,000 camels for a single shipment. 2,000 camels require forage, water, handlers, guards, rest stops. The caravan described by the British officer in 1842 would have needed support infrastructure along its entire route. Stations where animals could be watered and fed. Depots where supplies could be stored. Agreements with local leaders to ensure safe passage. This was not a casual operation. It was organized. It was systematic. It was expensive. And it only makes economic sense if the salt being moved was worth more than the cost of moving it. Which means the source had to be cheap, had to be abundant, had to be pure enough to justify the effort. Purity matters. Impure salt is less valuable. It spoils food instead of preserving it. It is harsh on livestock. It is less effective in industrial processes. The salt described in the records from Khiva and other hubs was noted for its purity. This suggests it was not surface salt. Surface deposits accumulate impurities. They mix with soil and organic matter. Pure salt comes from underground, from brine pools, from deposits that have been protected from contamination. Extracting pure salt requires either deep mining or controlled evaporation of brine. Both methods require infrastructure, both require knowledge, both require time, and both require a stable operation, not something that appears and disappears within a generation. The German geologist von Helmersen was careful in his language. He did not claim the lakes had vanished. He said they were no longer accessible. There is a difference. Inaccessible implies a barrier. Political, geographic, geological. It implies that the lakes might still exist, but that reaching them is no longer practical or permitted. If geological changes had made the terrain unstable, that would explain inaccessibility. If political changes had closed borders or redirected trade, that would also explain it. But both explanations assume the lakes were real, that they were once accessible, that they were once productive. In 1863, a Russian military expedition mapped the area around the Usturt Plateau. The plateau is a massive limestone formation between the Caspian and Aral Seas. It is largely barren. Water is scarce. But the expedition found evidence of old roads. Worn paths that crossed the plateau in straight lines. The paths were not natural. They had been graded. In some places, they had been reinforced with stone. The expedition followed one of these roads for several days. It led to a depression on the eastern side of the plateau. The depression was dry, but it showed signs of having once held water. The soil was layered with salt. The expedition collected samples. They noted that the salt was unusually free of gypsum and other common impurities. They speculated that the depression had been a lake. They did not speculate on where the water had gone. If the water had simply evaporated, the lake bed would have filled with sediment over time. Wind would have carried dust and sand into the basin. Plants would have grown in areas where moisture remained. But the depression was clean. The salt layer was exposed. The surrounding terrain showed no evidence of seasonal flooding. It looked as though the lake had drained quickly, as though something had opened beneath it. Karst formations can cause this. Limestone dissolves in water. Over time, underground voids form. If a void becomes large enough, the surface above it can collapse. The water drains into the void. The lake disappears. This process is well documented. It happens. But it is rare for it to happen on the scale that would be required to explain the descriptions in the historical records. The alternative is that the records are wrong, that the trade was smaller than described, that the sources were closer than believed, that the infrastructure was simpler, that memory and legend inflated the reality. This is possible. Human memory is unreliable. Stories grow in the telling. But the ruins do not inflate. The channels do not exaggerate. The stone does not lie. Something was built. Something was used. Something required effort and resources. And then something stopped. By the early 20th century, the Soviet Union controlled much of the territory once labeled as Tartary. Soviet geologists conducted extensive surveys. They were searching for resources: oil, gas, minerals, salt. They found all of these, but their reports also contain references to older workings, sites that had been mined or quarried before the modern era. In some cases, these sites showed evidence of techniques that were more advanced than expected: precision cutting, controlled blasting, drainage systems. The Soviet geologists noted this. They did not dwell on it. Their mandate was to assess current potential, not to investigate historical methods. The knowledge of how to extract and move salt at industrial scale existed. It was not magic. It was engineering. But engineering requires continuity. It requires institutions. It requires written records and trained personnel. When a system collapses, that knowledge can be lost. Not because it was secret, not because it was suppressed, but because no one needed it anymore. The next generation learned different skills. The old methods were not taught. The tools were not maintained. Within a few decades, what had once been common practice became forgotten. And once forgotten, it becomes difficult to reconstruct. Difficult to believe it was ever real. The maps drawn by European cartographers in the 18th and early 19th centuries show a different geography. Rivers that no longer flow, lakes that no longer exist, cities in locations that are now empty. For a long time, these maps were dismissed as errors, as fantasies, as the result of poor information. But as satellite imaging became available, some of the features on those old maps were confirmed. Dry riverbeds matched the courses drawn on the maps. Lake basins matched the locations. The cities were harder to confirm, but the geography was often accurate, which means the cartographers were recording real information. Information that became outdated not because it was wrong, but because the landscape changed. The salt roads of Central Asia were part of a larger network. They connected to the Silk Road. They connected to trade routes moving north into Siberia and south into Persia and India. Salt moved west. Silk moved east. Metals moved in both directions. The network was resilient. It adapted to political changes. It rerouted around conflicts, but it could not adapt to environmental collapse. If the water sources failed, the network failed. And if the network failed, the cities that depended on it failed. This is not speculation. This is pattern. It has happened in other regions. The Aral Sea itself is a modern example. It was once the fourth largest lake in the world. Soviet irrigation projects drained the rivers that fed it. Within decades, it shrank to a fraction of its former size. Fishing towns became desert outposts. The economy collapsed. The population left. In a century, future archaeologists might find those towns and wonder why anyone built there. The difference is that we have records of what happened to the Aral Sea. We have photographs. We have data. We have explanations. For the lakes and sources that supplied the salt roads, we have fragments. We have hints. We have reports that were filed and forgotten. And we have ruins that do not fit the timeline we have been given. Ruins that suggest a level of organization and infrastructure that is difficult to reconcile with the idea of nomadic tribes moving salt by camel. Nomads do not build stone channels. They do not construct evaporation basins large enough to process thousands of tons per season. They do not leave behind precision-cut drainage systems. Someone built those systems. Someone operated them. Someone maintained them. And then someone stopped. The question is not whether this happened. The evidence is clear that it did. The question is why. What caused a network that had functioned for generations to collapse so completely that within a single century it was almost forgotten? War can disrupt trade. But war does not erase geology. Plague can empty cities. But plague does not drain lakes. Climate change can shift rainfall patterns. But climate change over the past 1,000 years in Central Asia has been gradual. Not sudden. Not catastrophic. The records describe something sudden. Something that interrupted the network before it could adapt. In the archives of the Russian Geographical Society, there are reports from the 1830s and 1840s that were never widely published. These reports describe encounters with ruins, with structures that did not match known architectural styles, with inscriptions that could not be read. The explorers who filed these reports were not archaeologists. They were military officers, surveyors, traders. They noted what they saw. They did not have the training or the resources to investigate further. They moved on. The reports were filed. And in the decades that followed, as the region became more accessible, other priorities took precedence. Oil, railways, strategic positioning. The ruins were not a priority. They were cataloged, but they were not excavated. They were not studied in detail. They remain largely unstudied to this day. What would have been lost if the network collapsed suddenly? First, the knowledge of where the sources were. If the sources became inaccessible or dried up, there would be no reason to remember their exact locations. Second, the engineering knowledge required to operate them. If the facilities were abandoned, the techniques would not be passed on. Third, the economic relationships that made the trade profitable. If the supply disappeared, the merchants would find other goods to trade. The infrastructure would decay. The roads would fill with sand. The stations would be stripped for building materials. Within a generation, the physical traces would be faint. Within 2 generations, the memory would be vague. Within 3, it would be legend. This is not unique to Central Asia. It has happened in other places. The Romans built aqueducts. Some are still standing. Others have vanished. We know they existed because we have records, because we have fragments, because the engineering was so impressive that later generations remembered it. But there were other Roman structures that are known only from passing references in texts. Structures that served important functions but were not monumental. When those structures fell out of use, they were forgotten. The knowledge of how to build them was forgotten. Until modern archaeology rediscovered them, they existed only as footnotes. The salt roads are footnotes. They are mentioned in passing in histories of the Silk Road. They are referenced in economic studies of pre-modern trade. But they are not studied as a system. They are not mapped in detail. The sources are not identified with precision. And the ruins associated with them are not connected to the trade network in a systematic way. This is partly because the evidence is scattered. It is in Russian archives, in German geological surveys, in British military reports, in Persian and Central Asian chronicles that have not been fully translated. Connecting the pieces requires time, requires access, requires funding, and it requires someone to ask the question, to wonder why the network collapsed, to wonder what was lost. The uncomfortable truth is that we do not know. We do not know where all the salt came from. We do not know how it was extracted at the volumes described. We do not know what caused the sources to become inaccessible. We do not know why the infrastructure was abandoned so completely that within a century it was almost forgotten. We have theories, we have fragments, we have ruins, but we do not have a complete picture. And the longer we wait, the harder it becomes to reconstruct. The archives degrade, the ruins erode. The people who might have remembered stories from their grandparents are gone. The knowledge fades. What remains are questions. Why do the maps show lakes that no longer exist? Why do the geological surveys describe deposits that do not match current sources? Why do the ruins suggest infrastructure far more sophisticated than the historical narrative allows? Why did the trade collapse so suddenly? Why was it forgotten so completely? These are not questions with easy answers. They are not questions that fit neatly into established timelines. They are uncomfortable questions. Questions that suggest the history we have been given is incomplete. Not wrong, not fabricated, just incomplete, missing pieces, missing context, missing explanations. And perhaps that is the point. History is not a finished product. It is a process. New evidence appears. Old evidence is reevaluated. Patterns emerge that were not visible before. The salt roads are one of those patterns. They existed, they functioned, they collapsed. And somewhere in the ruins and the archives and the dry lake beds, the full story is waiting. Waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Waiting for someone to connect the fragments. Waiting for someone to look closely at what was lost and wonder why.